spoke about the idea that the Jewish people are called the kos, right? We spoke about the mushal of the fragile cups that the king had to mix in the hot with the cold in order so they shouldn't break or become frosted. Then we started, what is this mushal of the kos? The kos is, we said, the Indian of basically the sphere of Malchus of Atzilus. We said is also the gematria of Elohim. And we said it refers to what's called Knesset Yisrael. Knesset Yisrael, we said, was the gathering of Yisrael. What is Yisrael? Yisrael is the higher lights of Atzilus. And Knesset Yisrael is the gathering of those higher lights, which is into Malchus. And therefore it's called a cup, because it gathers those higher lights. It's also the source, Knesset Yisrael, and therefore this idea of Kos is also the source of what's called Neshamas Yisrael. And we said that these three things, connected with the idea that it's also the creation of the world, that through the sphere of Malchus, through this cup, right? Because Hashem wanted to create. Can you guys keep it down out there a little bit? Thank you. So he said that sometimes you gotta just pull rank. Didn't work, but we could try. So we said that Hashem wanted to create the world. This mashal for creation of the world was with these cups. So also Malchus is also responsible for the whole creation of the world, and more particularly, it's Knesset Yisrael, again the source of Neshamas Yisrael. And then we start, yeah.
Question first.
First question before. What's that? First question.
The creation of the world will be done through fragile cups.
Questions later. Let's do a little review first, and we can gather ourselves a little bit. So we started to explain that basically Hashem and the Jewish people are called Chassan and Kala. They're married to each other. And we said this is the ending of Matan Torah. This fusion and union took place at Matan Torah, right? And so we said what happens at the fusion? There's the relations, which is this notion that the tipa, right? This father creates this physical drop, which essentially contains his entire essence, and then it fuses and it's able to reproduce and clone, as it were, the father. And we said that this is the difference between the hashpah from a father to a son versus the Rav to a Talmid. That the Rav to a Talmid also gives off hashpah, but he obviously doesn't create a cup, as we said. He doesn't make another brain. If the person that he's talking to doesn't already have a brain, then he's ineffectual in his hashpah. And we said then that shows that if he can't give over his essence, what is he giving over? Then he's giving over a ray of his essence, right? And this is what intelligence, the hashpah of intelligence, is a spiritual transference. You're not giving over anything physical, and therefore you can't make anything new, like a new brain. But if the person already has a brain, you can give over this spiritual transference. And we said this is the difference between a spiritual transference versus the physical one. Even though it's quite paradoxical, the physical transference is actually obviously a much lower substance that's being transferred on the external chitzonius of it, right? The intelligence is this like fantastic, spiritual form which you're actually able to communicate and bring it to the other person, whereas the drop is like merely a putrid drop, as the Mishnah calls it. And yet this putrid drop, which in itself descends much, much lower and takes on a much more gashmias form, nonetheless, it's specifically that gashmias form that can actually transfer the essence of the father and actually create a new brain. So we said this is like Matan Torah, where the whole analogy is that when Hashem wanted to give over his essence, let's say when Hashem created the world, it wasn't as much of an essence, right? It was more of like, we say Hashem spoke and the world came into being. Because the speech of the world, let's say, is only an external expression of Hashem. But the giving of the Torah is like Hashem giving, so to speak, producing this seed which bears his essence. And therefore the whole essence of Hashem can come through this seed. And yet we ended off the class with the fact that this seed is actually totally useless and is unable to express the essence unless it goes into the nekeva, into the cup, right? Which is essentially, again, Knesset Yisrael or Neshamas Yisrael, and it's this bina yesera shenita liisha, this extra bina that the woman has that's actually able to like hatch this egg and actually create the essence to come be revealed. So it's true that the father can produce the seed, which is his essence, but on the contrary, as we said yesterday, if he produces this seed and it doesn't become a person, then it's actually kind of an unfortunate situation, right? Because he's brought forth his essence and it hasn't been revealed. Okay, any questions on, yeah?
So with the Torah, before it actually came down, like Torah B'Shemayim, what is that? Before it came to the top?
It's like a person's essence which has not yet come out of him, right? It's the seed before it becomes a seed. Well, we said in Tanya that the physical seed is actually produced in the brain. And when the brain will have sort of like this incredible experience of essentially, whatever creates that seed, then it draws on the very essence power of the person. That's why it's such a sin, Zarad Levatala, because it actually takes your very essence away from you, right? When you're producing the seed, it requires your full essence. So it's okay if you're going to make a whole baby out of it, but if you're not, like chaval on your essence to lose it. So before you produce that essence, it's a potential inside of you which has not yet been summoned. So too, the Torah, before it was given and Hashem sort of brought himself to this expression, it was a potential inside of Hashem's mind which hadn't yet been manifest. Yeah.
How is like by the mashal?
Mashal of what?
Like the seed of the man, it's like very physical.
Yeah.
How does that idea play out in the Torah that it's like also much?
Because it says that, like, right, Hashem Dafka gave the Torah to the physical world. The Torah is not even shaykh to the spiritual worlds. Like the angel said, Tana hodecha b'shamayim, right? Ten hodecha b'shamayim. They said, give us your glory in heavens. They wanted the Torah. They were jealous. So what did Moshe say? Yetzahar yech b'neichem. L'mitzrayim yiratem. He said all these things that show that the Torah is not even shaykh in Shemayim. It's only shaykh on earth. Only if you have a Yetzirah, only if you were in Egypt, only if you have the mitzvah of Kibud Av Ve'em, Gashmias. And therefore the Torah is not, Adrabah, like you're making the exact point he's trying to make. The Torah, as you see, was only able to be given to a physical world, just like the essence of a person can only come out when it becomes a physical seed. Right? Okay. We're going to go on. Shkoyach to you. V'dugma kazos. We're going to be on page Daled here, the bottom paragraph. Everybody inside, no phones, no distractions. We're learning Chassidus. We love life. Kedugma kazos anu motzim gam kein bedibor. Okay, so in a similar example, we find by the concept of speech. Even though we did say that speech was like connected more with a spiritual thing, the transference of Rav to Talmud, nonetheless, speech also bears to some degree this notion of being called Malchus. Remember, we started the whole conversation here that Malchus is called the speech of Hashem, Dibra Elyon. Just like a speech is a kli. Sorry to interrupt the flow right there, but just like a speech is a kli, which is receiving from the higher parts of your soul, your intellect, and your emotion, it goes into the speech. So it also has a quality of this Bina Yisera, as we're going to see. So too speech, yesh bo yisron koach al seichel umidos, right? So the speech also has an advantage over the seemingly much, much higher faculties of intellect and emotion. Just like we said right now, that the seed, which is physical, right, has an advantage over speech, which is spiritual. We're now saying that speech has an advantage over its higher faculties, which is intellect and emotion. Did you get that little twist there? We were comparing seed to speech, and now we're saying that even speech, which is lower than seichel and midos, it also plays the role of like this woman who's able to hatch the potential powers from above. The imayos, the kolagiloyim shebedibur hem mina seichel midos. Now, even though all the revelations in speech are nothing other than the intellect and the emotions, right? Speech, as we say, like leis le migar maklum. She has nothing of her own. There's no original speech that doesn't come from your intellect and your emotions. Speech on its own has nothing. It only has what you put into it. It only has what it receives from the higher powers. Like when a person speaks words of intellect and wisdom, at that moment, the speech is receiving from the intelligence which is shining into it. And the same is true when a person will speak words of love or anger. Harihem mekabel mina midos chesed gevura chulei. So what's happening there is your speech. Don't blame your speech, right? Don't shoot the messenger. The speech is just holding the emotions of anger, love or anger that are being produced, and the speech is catching it, carrying it, and sending it out. Right? It's a kli. V'ofen ha-kabbalah hu sh'metechila meir min ha-seichel o min ha-midos v'osios ha-machshava. And by the way, before it even gets to speech, there's a stage in between, which is that the manner of reception is that first it has to shine from the seichel or the midos into what we call the osios ha-machshava. Right? There's letters before the letters of speech, which are called letters of thought. And when you have an emotion, the first thing that happens is your emotion, or you have an intellect, the first thing that happens is that it cloaks itself into the letters of thought. And once it's already come into a certain form of letters, which is already a huge tzimtzum on the raw emotion, it then comes down those letters of thought, and they can sort of fit into the letters of speech. It's like the letters of thought are like an intermediary in order for them to actually come out and become physical letters. Chule. Umimela hariyagiloi or b'machshava yosem min adibur. And therefore, the obvious conclusion from that is that it shines more light in the letters of thought than it does in the letters of speech, right? That whatever thought letters you have are bearing more of the power of the emotion than whatever winds up dwindling down and getting out through the speech. Because the thought letters are the first receiver from the intellect and the emotion. Umeir b'machshava hagiloi or harbe yosef mi'adibur. A lot of noise is coming out of the kitchen, and it shines in machshava with greater light by far than the light that comes out of the mouth, right, of the speech. Right, because we said it's the first receiver, it has basically more of the raw emotion in it. Therefore, we're calling that more light than what winds up dwindling down to speech. And therefore, we say that the thought is united with the soul to the point that it's basically flowing constantly. Right? You can't ever turn off your thoughts. Thoughts are called like a river, and speech can be some kind called a yam, like a mikveh mayim, a gathering of water, which is not always flowing, right? You can actually like stop and collect it, because there's a time to speak, and you can also not speak if you want to. You can't not think. You're always producing letters of thought, right? Only thing you can do with them is change them at will. That's what the Tanya promises, and that's really the greatest gift that God gave us, which means you're in control to some degree of this operation, but you can't stop them. You can only change them, right? And so this is the idea that of the three garments of the soul, machshava, dibur, maisa, machshava is the only one that's called a levush penimi, right? It's an inner garment. Thought and speech are called the outer garments. They're basically outer expressions. The thought is really united with the soul. It doesn't, in other words, the emotions and the intellect, they're always hand in glove with the letters of thought. There's never a hand without a glove, right? They're immediately there together with the actual soul experience of love or fear or anger, whatever it might be.
What's the inner panimi?
What's that?
What's the inner panimi again?
Thought.
Thought.
Yeah, luvush hapanimi is thought. And therefore we call it united with the soul, to the point that it's continuously flowing. Ve'enu yotzim chutz le'etzem. It doesn't actually come outside of its source, right? When you speak, you like project. It's like exhaust that comes out. It's like you're shooting a power. When I throw a ball, for example, right? Where's the energy carrying that ball coming from? From me. I like shot something, and my own energy of my life force is flying across the room inside this ball. When you speak, it's a similar thing. You like eject, right, energy from yourself, out of yourself. But thought doesn't leave yourself. That's what it means. It's united with the soul. It's a product, but the product stays inside the box, right? It doesn't go out and project and exit. And that's what he says. Einan yotzim chutz le'etzem. They don't go out of the essence. Veina osios murgashim. And therefore, the letters are not felt, right? When I say the words with my mouth, it's actually like a thing, right? You can measure it, and you can check the sound waves. And it becomes what's called morgash, which means feelable, tangible. But the letters of thought are built-in morgash. They don't have a feel, right? They stay inside of you, just like your soul. They're spiritual like the soul. For the reason we said, hand in glove, they're nullified and united with the soul. They are there, but they're not, like, so to speak, identifiable as an entity separate from the emotion. Not so the letters of speech. As the wisest man said, that when it comes to letters of speech, there's something called pirud. What does pirud mean? Separation, right? And that's what it means. There's a time to speak and there's a time to be quiet, right? In other words, it's not a constant flowing thing that never stops. It actually, because it like separates from your body, you can turn it off, you can turn it on. Vehein misgalim v'yotzin chutz le'etzem. And like unlike the thought we just said, they actually do exit the essence. Vehem boyim b'morgash. Those two qualities that we said thought doesn't have, speech does have. One is they leave the essence, they actually project their own separate identity from the soul, and they become tangible. Chule. And why is this? It's because the light becomes extraordinarily contracted inside of them. Unlike what we said, the first receiver, which was the letters of thought, there's a major amount of light in them. It doesn't even exit the soul. It's basically sitting inside of its source, being like totally enlightened by the emotion or the intellect. These guys, the letters of speech, because they come out, it shows that they're completely diminished, like extraordinarily, in the amount of energy that actually goes inside of them. For it to hatch and become its own identity, it needs to be basically reduced in its energy. And therefore, this is the reason why they become tangible and they leave the essence. It's because the light is extraordinarily contracted. Masha ein kain, ba'osios machshava. Not the case with the letters of thought. Shemeir behema or begila yoser. There's much more light inside of them. Shezeu sibas kol achilukim anal. And because there's more light, that's the reason for all the differences that we just said, which was again tangibility, right, and exitability. Right? The more light you have, the less you're going to come out and show yourself and become tangible. So based on how much light they have, that's the difference. Shebein machshav ledibur chule. Kamo shekasuv makom acher, as it says elsewhere. Everyone with me? Nimsa the kol kabbalas or hadibor hu minas seichel midos. But getting back to our point, it comes out that all the reception of the light of speech, speech itself is not the origin of any of this. It has nothing. It's just a receiver from the intellect and the emotion. Umeya or machshava yoser ma'adibor. And not only that, but the thought receives more light than the speech. V'kein tzirufi yoser sadibor. Hu mina chochma dafka. This is where things get a little bit interesting. Right? So he says also the letter combinations of speech, they also come from chokhmah. In other words, what are we saying? If you're going to express, let's say, a speech of anger, obviously the meaning inside of that speech, which is that the person's going to feel your wrath, right, is coming from the emotions. The speech does not engender that itself. But more than just the energy and the meaning behind your speech, the actual specific letter combinations, because you could express anger in many, many different words, right? Now the meaning and the content behind the anger is the same, and we're saying that the speech receives that message from the emotions, but also the actual letter combinations, the exact words you're going to say, also speech does not come up with that, right? The speech sort of just takes the directions. In this case, we're going to say from chokhmah. Chokhmah is a high function of the soul, and it's the one that drums up the letter combinations. Right? From your faculty of chokhmah, it forges these unique letter combinations which are going to hold whatever meaning and emotion you're gonna put into this speech. So what we're saying is this, the point he's trying to make is the speech really does nothing. It doesn't provide the intent, the emotion, and it doesn't even provide the combination of letters that's going to hold that emotion. Neither of those things is speech responsible. It's a receiver on both ends, right? That's what we're saying here. Kamosha kasu mitzaref lechochma. He says here, mitzaref lechochma is basically that. Well, it's a proof of kind of what he's saying, that the chochma is the one who's mitzaref. Mitzaref means the one that's going to make the letter combinations. Right? V'lefi ofen giloy haseichel, whatever manner is the revelation from the intellect, keinu atzur osios. That's going to be what the osios, what the letters forge as and combine as. When you put one letter after the next, another letter after the next, another letter after the next, you make a word. If you do that a few more times, you make a whole sentence. Where does I can say this to you in several ways, right? In many, many different avenues, one can express to you, I just did it, right? I said the same sentence in totally different letters, right? And we could probably sit here and everyone can come up with their own way of saying, I want to tell you something, right? Go ahead. Lay it on me. You got something to say? What do you think, Yudel?
I want to share an idea.
All these things is the exact same thing, basically, right? But the fact you're going to put it in different letter combinations comes from a unique power of chokhmah that says, I'll provide the letters and their combinations, right? You might think that your faculty of speech is producing those. That's what he's saying. Don't get that thought in your head. Speech doesn't have anything of its own. It doesn't have the meaning, and it doesn't have the letter combinations, right? The meaning comes from, well, it depends. If you're saying something intellectual, it comes from the mind. If you're saying something emotional, it comes from the heart. And the letter combinations, how that meaning is going to be conveyed, comes from the chokhmah. And that's this pasuk that it says, mitzaref lechokhmah, that chokhmah is the letter combiner, right? Lefi ofen gilei haseichel, in accordance with how the intellect reveals itself, kein hu hatzirufi osios. That's going to be this grouping of letters, shebehem mislavish or haseichel, with which the light, i.e. the meaning, the intent of the seichel, will come and be carried. Is everyone following this idea?
Doesn't this process happen in machshava?
No, machshava too is a levush which receives. It's just that machshava is like dibur in that sense. Machshava also doesn't have anything of its own. It's just that it's the first receiver. And so therefore it has a much more gigantic dose of light, which doesn't enable it to have a separate existence. It sort of stays inside you. But it doesn't, machshava also is equally, it's just a levush. It equally produces nothing.
It doesn't produce the words.
It does not produce the words. No. It's very, no, it's like it requires a moment of reflection on this. It's a very deep thing that he's saying. Where do your words come from? You might think that I'm thinking, so therefore I'm producing these letters. That's not where the letters come from. There's a much deeper faculty in the soul called chokhmah, which is the highest of your faculties, basically, which has this unique ability to just basically create this canvas and draw up the whole plan. And then what happens is the machshava receives those letters, and the machshava further receives the input that's going to be carried in those letters, right? The meaning or the intelligence, all of that is coming from your higher faculties, intellect and emotion, and the thought, speech, and action are only containers for it. They don't produce it.
Would tonality be an emotion?
Tonality, the tone of your voice?
Because it's like,
For sure.
it's not what you say, but the way you say it. So you can say things in different tones and it means something.
Yeah. I would probably put that more into the emotion,
Emotion.
because there's no letter combinations in tonality. I mean, a little bit. There's something there, like literally, like a musician, you can change the key and scale. There might be something of like a letter combination involved in that. But yeah. So based on the chokhmah, it will produce these letters. Right, we got up to this little parentheses, correct? The imayos shegilu aseichel hu bechinas hasaga debina. Now, even though the revelation of intellect is really what we call the hasaga of bina, what does that mean? It means when you talk about intellect, it's you mean like you're actually there's actually a content and an idea that you're flowing with, right? And we normally generally associate that with Bina. Why? Bina is like the hay of Hashem's name. The hay of Hashem's name is more of like a container. It has length, width, depth. Those 3 lines of the hay means that you can actually hold something. So when you talk about the actual content, which is an intellectual idea, that usually is associated with Bina. But the Tzirufe Osios, but that's, like, again, you have to delineate the distinction, like we just had that little exercise. You could say the same meaning, but with different letters. So the meaning, in fact, what you kind of mean, comes from Bina, because that's where the real concept of an idea is forged, because it has length, width, and depth, and it's a containable idea. But what package that idea is going to come out in, with particular letters, that one sage will say it in these letters, and another sage will say the exact same idea in different letters, but it's the same svara, it's the same opinion, that faculty comes from Chokhmah.
So what's the difference between Bina and Isis
Again, well, first of all, I mean, that's actually a very loaded question that you didn't even mean to ask, because sometimes they are the same. But in this context, we're saying they're far from the same. Osios of Machshava is basically, it's like saying what's the difference between your shirt and your brain. In a certain sense, there's no comparison whatsoever, because Osios of Machshava, even though we tend to think that this is where ideas come from, because when we're thinking them, we're thinking that this is the source of the idea. The reality is it's just a receiver of letters that the idea is being deposited into. And not only is the Machshava a group of letters that an idea is deposited into, but even those groupings of letters are created from a higher level, which was what Yudel's question was. That even the letters of the thought and the idea that goes into the thought neither of them are produced by the thought. So what's the difference between Bina? Bina is the actual thought, is the actual idea. The thought is merely the letters which hold that idea. And by the way, as we've just described, those letters are not created by Bina. Right? The letters which hold the thought of Bina are forged by Chokhmah, which is the little marriage between Chokhmah and Bina that takes place. The father says, I'll bring the letters, you bring the idea. Right? Mami.
Be Das, I guess?
Where are we getting Das out of?
It's the both of them together. That from the Chokhmah, from the idea into the Bina, expanding the idea, you're able to get into something practical, which is the thoughts of your letters.
You're saying because they come together, then they can give birth.
Give birth to something that's actually helpful.
Okay, yeah. You need both of them. They need to fuse. So once they fuse, the child that they have is the thought, right? Not that the das is the thought, right? Not that you were saying that das is like the thought.
Not the thought, yeah. It's the next thing.
The das is not the thought, right? The das is the connection between those two things. What does das mean? Adam yada es chava. It means to join two things together.
No.
But in the biblical sense, knowledge, right? He knew her,
Right.
which means he fused with her,
Right.
which means that. But the product is what we're interested in, right? So it's not the fusion that makes the letters of thought. It's enabling the letters of thought to now come out, because now you have a kli and a light, the letter and the meaning. So if Das didn't put Chokhmah and Bina together, then nothing would be born from them. But Das itself is not the letters of thought, right? All right, going on inside. Hasaga de Bina, we're in the parentheses, right? So even though the revelation of the actual idea is from the Hasaga of Bina, the grasping of Bina, in other words, the actual idea, but Tzirufe Osios Amritzarv the Chokhmah. When it comes to the Tzirufe Osios, the actual letters that are enclosed, that the idea decides to dress up in, that comes from Chokhmah, as we said. It's a power of Chokhmah that's above Bina. The actual letters. Ha'inyan, the imayos at Tzirufi Ofi Osios, hem lefi ofen aseicho, hamaluvash behem. Now, even though the letter combinations are not totally divorced, right? On the contrary, they are in accordance with the manner of intellect which will be placed in them. Because I'm not going to just make random letters that do not correspond in any way whatsoever with the meaning of what I'm trying to say, correct? So in other words, there's obviously an association with the letter combinations to the meaning. Mikom makom hayav sharlios asech b'tziruf macherim. Very simple, like what we said. Nonetheless, you could have put that meaning into a whole other set of letters, which would have conveyed a similar meaning. So even though they're not totally divorced from each other, because obviously there's going to be some association with these letters to this idea, but they're not exactly married to each other because they could be 100 different letters to carry that same idea. It doesn't you can go a million ways with the particular letters that you're going to convey an idea with. For example, Kamo Tevos Adon Olam. He gives us a practical example. Take the words "Master of the Universe." Right? Adon Olam. Sha'or HaSeichel HaMeluvash B'Tevos Elu. That the light of intellect, in other words, the content, the meaning, which is encloaked in those particular letters, right? Those particular 8 letters. What is the meaning behind it? Hu Inyan HaMelucha HaMemshala. He right away gives you different letters to say the same thing. It's Hashem's kingdom. It's Hashem's dominion. Shemoshel B'Sholat Ala Olam. That He dominates and rules over the world. Look, we just gave a whole other set of words that basically mean Adon Olam. You're not saying anything different, you're just using different words.
It's Adon.
Adon means master. Hariaskala zu atzma, this very content, this very idea, hayav shalis lavish b'tziruvi osios acherim. It could have been invested and cloaked in different letter combinations. Kamo, here you go. Melech haolam, there's another one. Adon Olam could be Melech haolam. It's like, take your pick. V'kadome, and many other things. In other words, yes, there's a slight difference, but basically the meaning is the same. The imkein, and if so, mashanis lavish asech b'tzrufi osios elu, and therefore this that the idea wound up sitting in these particular letters. Ein, eino, it's supposed to be eino, min haseichel atzmo. Look at that. It's not from the intellect itself. Right? In other words, the fact that it goes into these particular letters is not really part of the idea. It doesn't, right? Because the intellect comes from Bina. The idea maker comes from Bina. Right? The flesh and bones of what you really mean to say comes from Bina. And there's this like other guy who comes in who's not associated so much with what you're saying, what idea you're coming up with. He's just a letter maker. He just like produces letters. He's like, here, take these. Right? That's what it means. Mitzaref lechochma. He's just like like someone who's mitzaref lekesef. You're just a silversmith, right? Just producing the vessels. So he's saying that the actual letters are not really coming from the seichel. They're coming from a different source. It's the one who is busy banging out the letters. So that the seichel can have a place to land and be held so that they become productive and they can be expressed. Who are they being expressed to? First, yourself. How do you like that? You can't even express your own idea to yourself unless you have this little marriage of your chokhmah and bina, because if you don't have letters appearing in your mind to like basically structure the idea, it stays in this like formless place. So for you to even think of an idea, it's because your chokhmah and bina married and produced certain letters which were able to contain this particular hasaga that you were working on. And sometimes the letters will come out this way, sometimes the letters will come out that way. It's a very deep, deep thing in your soul, almost like bechira chavshis, right? Where you just like sort of decide, I'm going to go with these letters. It's really what makes one person different from another. Is that your unique koach of chokhmah, it just has its own like design, literally design, where it prefers and uses certain letters, certain languages, certain generations have different ways of expressing themselves and so forth. It comes from this unique power of chokhmah. This is all in the parentheses, by the way. The power of this forging of the combinations is a chokhmah power. Shemisham nimshach gilui haseichel, v'gam be'izo ofen yu hatzirufi osios shebehem yislavish haseichel. So it's interesting. Now he's giving a little bit of a deeper twist on the matter in this last sentence, because he adds a word. He says the letter combinations comes from chokhmah, and then he says these few words which seem to contradict what we just said, but they don't. He says shemisham nimshach gilui haseichel. From there, from chokhmah, it's revealed the revelation of the Seichel. Didn't we say a second ago that Bina was the Seichel and Chochmah is just the letter makers?
Yes.
But now he's saying that from Chochmah is drawn forth the revelation of the Seichel. Why is that? Because Chochmah and Bina have another relationship, which means that really the Bina, as we know, right, is nothing more than a drawing forth of the latent inner powers of Chochmah. It's just that like Chochmah, which is compared to the Yud, it's a point inside of you. And therefore you can't really call it a Hasaga until that point becomes a Hey, which has length, width, and depth. So even though when it finally comes out as a Hey, we point to it and say, hey, that's where the intellect is happening, that's where the Hasaga is happening, otherwise nothing is graspable. The reality is that Hey came from the Yud, and therefore not only does the letter combinations come from the Yud, which is Chochmah, the actual idea also its origin is in the Yud of Chochmah. It's just that it can't really be seen as a hatched idea until the Chochmah comes out as Bina, and the Chochmah comes out and produces letters for that Bina. Before we go on, everyone following this? Any questions? No one's following, and therefore there's no questions? No, but a little bit following?
What was the second creation from Chochmah?
The one that was a little bit of a chiddush in this last line was just that Bina also comes from Chochmah at the end of the day, right? So even though we said a moment ago that the idea, like the light, if you will, comes from Bina, and the Kli, the letters, come from Chochmah, the reality is also the light also comes from Chochmah, but not directly. In other words, if you look at Chochmah, you can't see any light because it's just a point. If Bina will come out of Chochmah, it will bring the light out, and then we sort of blame Bina for having this idea. The reality is the source of this idea was also in Chochmah, right? But it comes out and shows itself in Bina. Fine, so that's one product of Chochmah. It brings the light. But then simultaneously, it's the source of all things. It also brings the letters which are going to contain that light. And that's what we've been saying up until now. That Bina is the source of the light, Chochmah is the source of the letters. All we did now is we add like a little interesting detail that actually Bina itself comes from Chochmah. So the light and the letters ultimately come from Chochmah. But the difference being is that the letters are, in a certain sense, let's understand this point because it's actually very crucial. The letters, in a certain sense, are more obviously like Chochmah than the light. Someone tell me why. The letters, why are we saying a second ago that the letters come from Chochmah and the light comes from Bina? When in reality the light also comes from Chochmah because Chochmah produces Bina. But why did we have a whole paragraph first explaining that the letters come from Chochmah and the light comes from Bina? What's so Chochmah-like about those letters? That's a good question to see if anyone has any idea what's going on over here. What's that?
There's unlimited potential from these letters.
Unlimited potential of combinations. Okay, what else?
They're random.
They're random? Why is that Chochmah-like?
Because there's no clear delineation yet. It's just like it's like kind of what Shmuel said.
But on the contrary, the letters are literally the delineation.
But it's infinite letters.
It's not really. It could have infinite letters, but it comes out as these letters. That's the whole point.
But the R is not what makes them. The
What?
R is the idea which is in the letters.
Okay, where do we get or? We're talking about why are letters Chochmah-like? More than
They're infused with Chachma.
what's what?
To bring us up to the next level.
They were giving shape to the Chachma.
What did we say before that Chochmah's thing was? It's the Yud, right? The Yud is the unexpressed, like sort of unknown, idealess source of the idea, right? It's a point which has no expression and has no meaning, right? That's like letters. The letters are just cups. They're like vessels. They don't have any meaning to them. The meaning is infused with the light which is sitting inside those letters, right? But the letters are like dummies, kind of. The letters, in fact, are called stones for this very reason, that there's no expression in the letters themselves. The letters only gain expression when you put something into them, which is meaning. And you understand that?
It's the information of the sequence.
What's that?
The letters are the vehicle, not the driver.
No, it's an information sequence of the letters that has the information, right? It's the meaning comes from the order that the letters are in.
The meaning comes from the order that the letters are in. I'm not.
Which is a
I mean, you
pre-verbal
may be
intelligence.
right about that, but that's not really what the gist of what we're saying here. What we're saying here is that the meaning, in a sense, is an independent thing. That's why I could say this meaning in 100 different letter combinations, because the letter combination actually has nothing to do with the meaning, right? Based on the fact that you could say the same thing in 100 different letters means that the meaning is not derived from the letters, right? The meaning is its own thing, and the letters are just a kli which holds them. So what is a kli? A kli is something which is devoid of light. It's just like a dumb rock, right? That's similar to chokhmah in a weird sense, because chokhmah is a point which shows you no light. Until bina comes out of chokhmah and sort of derives light from this point, the chokhmah itself doesn't show you anything. It's like a dummy. I mean, obviously it's the greatest faculty we have, but because it's hidden and because it's all in a point it doesn't reveal any light. It's more like a kli in that capacity than it is like light.
But it's not that it doesn't have light. We're just
Right? Because the light comes out of it as bina.
We're like quantum
The light comes out of it, and when it does, it's called bina, right? But fine, so we said that. We said we're not like knocking chokhmah. Chokhmah is also the source of the light. But when we kind of lay it all out and we say the light comes from bina and the vessel comes from chokhmah, why do we do that if the light also comes from chokhmah? And the reason is because the chokhmah in its source does not have light in an obvious way. It only comes as light when it comes into bina. If it lays still up as the light is in chokhmah, it's dark. And therefore it's more keli-like than light-like. And even though therefore chokhmah produces the light and the kli, when we sort of lay it out, we say the light comes from bina, and the combination of letters, which is like a dark matter, that's from chokhmah. Yeah, does anyone understand that, what I just said? You look like you understand, I'm happy to see. Anybody else?
until those letters are filled by way of.
Even when the letters are filled, right? If I have wine or water or the most delicate, best wine from Sheish Yimei Bereish inside of this cup, the cup itself doesn't care what is inside of this cup. It's like a dumb container, which with no, it doesn't reveal intrinsically the greatness of what's inside of it, right? It's just there to hold it.
So at what point does it express itself?
The letters really don't. The letters are sort of like we said.
but
If a person doesn't already know the letters or the language, then they have no revelation from those letters.
So then it's subjective?
They're like translucent,
communal.
like vehicles for the information inside, if you know how to translate the letters. And if you don't know how to translate the letters, it's like a cup, which is a blocked cup holding the wine of the 6 days of creation.
But then if somebody doesn't understand Mishnah Kodesh, they can't read it. And so
That's
they
right.
see the letter.
That's right. So the letters actually become blocking. They become a blocker, not a revealer. And that's the whole point. They're more like chokhmah, which has no light. It doesn't show you anything in itself. And yet, on the same token, this secret of chokhmah that shows no light, it shows no light because it's higher than light, right? Not because it's lower than light. And yet when it produces these letters, which seemingly are lower than light, they're only carrying the light, they are sort of showing you a signal back to their source and saying, you think I'm lower than you because I don't have any revelation? Let me tell you a little secret. Chokhmah doesn't have any revelation, and it's your boss. So they are an expression of a quality of chokhmah, which is something that can't be seen. Therefore, on the low end, they look like dummies, kalim, that don't have any expression. They're just vehicles holding the real meaning. But we say that their source is chokhmah for this very reason, that ultimately that itself shows on a very high level, which is beyond revelation.
So the letters, are they aware of what's inside of them?
Are they aware? I would say no, right? Like rocks. We're all surrounded by rocks. And here inside the rocks is this Adam, right? Torah class. The rocks, only in some very ethereal way, are catching the rays of our ideas here, right? They're not in a regular conversation amongst human beings, right? They're just holding the Adam. They don't actually have anything to do with the Adam, right? Okay. Let's finish up this paragraph. I don't know if you guys are on the page here, but I feel like I don't know what else to say about that. Yeah?
Does Chachma have some connection with Malchus in that sense? That they both are like.
Malchus is called Chochma Tata for that reason. It's called the lower Chochma.
So what would be the difference?
The difference is just whether it is seen as the source of the light, which means it's dark, or it's seen as the kli holding the light, which is also dark, but it's like dark on an end where you're going to say, oh, poor kli, you don't understand anything. Whereas when it's on the high end, you're not going to say, oh, poor kli, because it's the source of all the information. It's just unseeable. You get that? All right, let's finish this paragraph. I'll let you guys ruminate. How do you say? Ruminate. Marinate on this in a minute. We're almost done. Let's focus for one more second here. Do we get to the end of the? We got to the end of the paragraph, the parentheses? Yeah. Okay. So right, the last line. Nimtza, it comes out. Dikol kabbalas hadibor, hum min haseichel. All right, let's get back. Remember, that was a parentheses. That was a very interesting parentheses, but it was just a parentheses. What are we trying to say before we get into all that complications? We were just simple. That dibor is a kli of reception. Right? It is not producing anything. It has nothing of its own. It doesn't have its own meaning. It doesn't even have its own letters, the poor thing. It's a Kabbalah, right? The Kabbalah is a dibur hu min haseichel. It receives from the intellect. And it is not even the first receiver, right? The first receiver is the letters of thought, and only then does it come into the letters of speech. Be'im kaid, and if so, l'chora einu shayach sheyet tosefes or seichel v'chochma b'dibor yoser mekemoshu b'seichel v'chochma shebemoach. And if so, this is a very leading question. You're going to see the next tomorrow's class starts with the words "however." So we're going to be asking a question, and only tomorrow we're going to get to "however." But I'll let you in on the secret. But he says like this: if so, if dibor is merely a receiver, and this is like we're finally getting to like the point of the whole mimer right here. Seemingly, it's not shaykh to say that there should be extra light of seichel and chochma in dibor more than there is in the seichel and chochma that is in the actual brain. Since me'acher de misham lakach kol hagiloi or shel adibor. Since the brain was the place when you took all the light for the speech, right? How can the kli, which is receiving its entire existence, both its meaning and its letters from the chokhmah, how could it ever produce more light than the chokhmah itself? And the next word is nevertheless, it does, right? And we're going to go into major proofs over here how actually when you talk, you wind up bringing out more brilliance than when you think to yourself. And that should not be the case based on everything we just said, that speech is merely a receiver and it doesn't have anything of its own, so how can it all of a sudden trump and outdo its own source? It doesn't even make any sense until he's going to explain to us how it does. But right now we're just at the question. Obviously, Malchus cannot have more light than Chochma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, since all it is a receiver of those things, right? How's it all of a sudden going to outdo them? It seemingly can't. Makol Makom, tomorrow we're going to see that nonetheless it does. And that's basically the whole point of this entire Hemshech.
Does this have to do with the sphere of influence that Malchus has over the rest of the
We'll see. We will see.
spheroids?
We shall see. But the point is, this is your first class. I'm going to tell you, we don't end
the thought, right? But
say it again.
I said speech. Your speech